Over millions of years, species of plants and animals have adapted to the environmental conditions in which they live. This has led to an amazing variety and biodiversity of life on our planet. Coral has found a niche in shallow tropical waters. Ducks have adapted to live in the ponds and waterways. Kudus and oryxes thrive on the savanna grasslands of Africa. But organisms do not live in isolation. They live within ecosystems, a habitat where plants, animals, and microorganisms interact with each other and with their natural surroundings. There are many types of ecosystems. A pond is a good example. So is an ocean shore, a farmer's field, or a forest glen. An ecosystem includes both the biotic, or living components, and the abiotic, or non-living components of the system. All of the living organisms found in an ecosystem are known as its biota. These living things integrated together make up a community. In order for a species to survive, it must have a niche within the community so it can gain the food necessary for its survival and reproduce its young. We are going to look at the interdependence that exists within ecosystems and point to some of the pressing environmental problems that are threatening many of our ecosystems today. In every ecosystem, there are two different types of organisms, producers and consumers. The producers, or autotrophs, can produce their own food. These are photosynthesizing organisms like plants and some microorganisms. Consumers are called heterotrophs. There are different types of consumers. Herbivores that only eat plants are classified as primary consumers, and carnivores are called secondary consumers because they live off the primary consumers. Fungi and bacteria that eat dead and decaying organisms are called decomposers, but they also are consumers. They are very important in the food web because they break down dead matter like grass, tree trunks, and the remains of animals so that nutrients are returned to the soil. Within an ecosystem, all of the producers, consumers, secondary consumers, and decomposers make up an interdependent community. One of the ways that they interrelate is through the food web. The food web within an ecosystem is actually made up of many overlapping food chains of predators and prey. For example, on the African plain, grass grows in abundance. A herbivore, such as an antelope, eats the grass. A carnivore, like a lion, kills and devours the antelope. Jackals eat the remains. Worms, ants, and bacteria consume what is left, and someday will feed on the lions and jackals when they die. Since most species eat and are eaten by more than one other species, these food chains link together into a food web. Consequently, changes affecting one group ultimately can impact on several others. Food chains exist in all ecosystems. There are many different cycles within communities of organisms, but there are also cycles within the abiotic, or non-living components of ecosystems. Energy flows through the ecosystem. First, energy is captured by the producers, those plants and microorganisms that can produce their own food by photosynthesis. Then, the energy passes along the food chain to consumers, such as herbivores, carnivores, and decomposers. All of these different feeding levels, or trophic levels as they are called, form a type of energy pyramid in ecosystems. As the energy passes from level to level, less and less usable energy is available to organisms at the higher levels. Biologists estimate that on average only 10% of the plant's accumulated energy is passed on to the body of the organism that eats it. Where does the rest go? Some is used for digestion, work, growth, and reproduction, but only about 10% remains in the tissue of the animal that ate it. The rest of the energy is dissipated as heat. When the energy is passed to the next trophic level, for example, from the herbivore that eats the plant to the carnivore that eats it, the energy that is retained again is reduced to 10%, and the rest is not available. At each trophic level, there is a decrease of about 90% of the energy available. Despite this reduction in energy, the ecosystem is sustainable because the number of organisms, or biomass, at each trophic level is also reduced by at least 90%. The biomass at the bottom level is so great and replenishes itself so quickly, it can sustain the organisms at the higher levels. While energy flows through ecosystems, a number of other substances are recycled and never lost. Water, a necessity of life for all living things, is constantly recycled. It can lie in a lake for a time and then flow into the sea. It evaporates into the atmosphere. The wind blows the water vapor a distance, and then it falls as rain. The water can remain in the soil, be absorbed by plants, and drunk by animals. It is constantly being recycled, not only through ecosystems, but also through the entire biosphere. The carbon cycle is based on carbon dioxide, CO2. During photosynthesis, producers, such as plants, build carbon compounds. When plants are eaten, the carbon is broken down by cellular respiration and used as energy by other organisms, but most is released into the atmosphere or into the oceans where it is recycled. Carbon is also trapped in fossil fuels, such as oil and coal. When these fuels are burned, they release the carbon into the atmosphere. Over time, the carbon dioxide has built up in the atmosphere to produce what is called the greenhouse effect and global warming, one of the most serious environmental problems that we are facing. At the local level, ecosystems can be overwhelmed by heavy concentrations of any of the elements that enter the system. For example, nitrogen makes up 78% of the Earth's atmosphere, but only very small amounts are in the soil, oceans, and organisms. It is recycled through ecosystems by some plants, bacteria, and decomposers. In recent years, large amounts of nitrogen fertilizer has been added to the soils to increase crop production. This is leading to the acidity of soils and the pollution of watercourses. Phosphorus is also required as a nutrient for plants, and like nitrogen, it is being added to soils in fertilizer. Runoff from farmland containing these two chemicals overstimulates algae growth in lakes and rivers. This robs the water of oxygen and suffocates the aquatic life. There is constant interaction between all organisms and ecosystems. Competition for scarce resources is often greatest between organisms that obtain their food in similar ways. Trees push their branches high into the crown of the forest cover in order to reach the sunlight essential for photosynthesis. At the same time, they send their roots deep into the ground to get water and minerals. Those trees that cannot get enough of these essentials will die. In a similar way, sharks in the ocean will compete for food with other sharks and other fish-eating species. In a competitive ecosystem with scarce resources, the species that is more efficient or stronger will be the one that survives. Coyotes will drive out or eliminate foxes when they compete for the same resources, and wolves will drive out coyotes. This is called competitive exclusion. Predation is a term used to describe the relationship between organisms that eat other organisms. Perhaps the most obvious example of this is when carnivores kill and eat their prey, but there are other forms of predation. Herbivores eating plants, or spiders capturing flies, are both forms of predation. There is often a cyclical relationship between the hunters and the hunted. As the numbers of animals in the prey population increase, usually the numbers of predators increase. And when there is a crash in the prey population, the numbers of predators decrease. For example, when drought reduces the number of herbivores on the African savanna, the number of big cats, such as leopards, decrease. When the relationship between predator and prey is upset, there can often be serious problems in ecosystems. For example, in parts of the American Southwest, cougars were eliminated because they killed domestic animals. As a consequence, the deer population rapidly multiplied. In time, overgrazing by the deer resulted in soil erosion, and the lack of food ultimately led to their starvation. In recent years, cougars have been reintroduced. The deer population has been reduced, but those that survive are much healthier. There are many fascinating examples of how organisms have evolved means to avoid being preyed upon. Cacti and thistles have developed spikes and thorns. Porcupines have quills. Turtles have shells. And rhinos have a tough skin like a suit of armor. Camouflage is another tactic. Some insects can mimic their surroundings so well they almost disappear. And a chameleon can change the color of its skin to blend in and hide. Within ecosystems, organisms often work together for their mutual survival. When one-sided relationships exist, it is called commensalism. Barnacles attach themselves to whales. This gives them protection and lets them reach new sources of food. When both species benefit from a close relationship, it is called mutualism. Certain birds cling to animals like cattle or African buffalo and eat the insects that they attract. Bees and hummingbirds take the nectar from the blossoms of plants and in turn play a vital role in pollinating the flowers. When one organism lives on another and gets its nourishment from the host, it is called parasitism. Many fungi and bacteria are parasites. Vines climb up trees and ultimately can kill them by capturing all of the sunlight with their leaves. Fleas live in the hair of animals, and roundworms can live within the digestive tracts of humans. Communities of organisms within ecosystems are constantly changing to meet new environmental conditions, climatic changes, or the sudden arrival of a new species. Sometimes there can be very dramatic changes. After a volcanic eruption, all that is left is exposed, barren rocks. Soon afterwards, a succession of plants invade the barren environment. Gradually, these pioneer communities give way to other vegetation native to that climate, and animals can move in because there is food to sustain them. This type of succession in communities not only happens on land, but also in aquatic environments. For example, many northern lakes in North America were formed when the most recent glacier retreated 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. At first, the lakes had little nutrition and almost no life. Then reeds and bulrushes began to grow by the shore. The water slowly became rich in nutrients and attracted algae and invertebrates. Fish began to live in the habitat along with ducks, amphibians, and various carnivores like herons. Ecosystems such as this can exist for many years, perhaps centuries, but lakes often silt up and turn into swamps and marshes with yet a different ecosystem and different community of organisms. Succession in any ecosystem is not strictly linear. Ecosystems constantly go through cycles of regeneration and change. A forest fire can replace a mature forest with young trees, and with it, new populations of birds and insects. As the forest matures, different species of trees will dominate while others decline. This cycle continues until another fire begins the process again. Human activity impacts local ecosystems virtually everywhere on the planet, and because they are all interconnected, the overall impact is global. If ecosystems are to remain healthy, they must maintain a rich diversity of living organisms. The biodiversity of ecosystems around the world is currently undergoing dramatic changes in species composition as a result of human intervention. The human population has been exploding. Agriculture has extended onto the most marginal lands. Air and water pollution has become so extensive that there is no part of the globe that is unaffected. A recent study by the United Nations Environment Program has found that the world's forests are vanishing at an alarming rate. Just 21% of the Earth's land area is now covered with healthy forests, and the authors fear that the richest patches of the remaining forests could vanish within decades. This will have serious consequences for soil erosion and the ability of plants to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Another example is the destruction of coral reefs due to the chemical runoff from farmland and the dumping of untreated sewage. The algae that thrive on these nutrients smothers the reefs and kills the reef ecosystem. The consequences of these human influences are that the rich biodiversity of ecosystems is being threatened. The alarming decline in the various species and the number of individuals within species has led many biologists to fear that we are in the midst of yet another mass extermination. But unlike the others, this extermination is the result of human destruction of ecosystems. The loss of biodiversity is one of the most serious issues facing us in the 21st century. Will we continue to uproot and destroy ecosystems and the vast numbers of organisms that live in them? Or will we learn to live with the rich biodiversity of life that has blessed our planet? Communities of plants, animals, and microorganisms are called. The primary distinction in an ecosystem is between the or living component and the or non-living component of the system. Heterotrophs can produce their own food. True or false? Organisms that break down dead matter are called. Food chains exist in all ecosystems. True or false? The term used to describe the relationship between organisms that eat other organisms is. Ecosystems constantly go through cycles of regeneration and change. True or false? The different feeding levels in an ecosystem are called levels. Biologists estimate that on average only % of the plant's accumulated energy is passed on to the body of the organism that eats it. When fossil fuels are burned, they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, contributing to the greenhouse effect and global warming. True or false?